3.5 years. That's how long it had been since I had last touched oil paints. Yet somehow I still agreed to paint a 75 by 90 centimeter realistic portrait for a client. So in this video, I will be showing you, rather talking to you about what I did to pull it off and what are the mistakes that almost ruined it. So hello everyone, my name is Gayatri and welcome back to another art vlog of Be Busy Bee. And this project was mostly confidence, panic and a lot of turpentine mixed together. Now this was only the second of its kind in terms of having an oil painting made by me, while this is the first ever oil painting that I had made of this size plus the whole element of making it realistic. My client had two very basic requirements, one being the size of the canvas, which was 75 by 90 like I mentioned earlier, and second was an 80s classical painting style. Now you might think that that is the difficult part, but let me tell you, it wasn't. Because I was searching all the stores online and offline looking for a canvas of that size, but nothing really helped. But it was finally one very small local store here in Hyderabad where I could find a complete roll of canvas that was being sold, and the shopkeeper was just kind enough for me to just cut it into the given dimensions and give it to me. So the first art lesson for today is to befriend your local art store owner. Since I didn't have a big enough table which could fit all of this big canvas, the apparatus that kind of takes it for me to paint, I joined two study tables together and I laid my canvas flat, kept a lamp and kept another additional table for my rags, paints, brushes, turpentine, oil and all of that stuff. So not exactly like a Renaissance studio, but it definitely worked somewhere. And honestly, when painting something of this size, laying it flat was a good choice and a good decision for me, because then the gravity isn't really pulling it down where the oil or the paint is dripping. So it's all flat, the paint is laid flat, and it gives the entire opportunity for the paint to dry as is on the surface. So let's get down to understanding how it is that I exactly did, or what were the steps I had followed. So the first one was setting up the battlefield, like I'd like to call it. Now the reference photo was very tiny when compared to the kind of scale that was being imagined here. And the best way to go about this was the grid method. So I divided the reference photo into squares and then recreated the same grid on the canvas. Now this does two important things. The first one is that it breaks a very complicated portrait into small manageable sections. And second, it stops your brain from doing that annoying thing where it suddenly decides that the nose belongs somewhere near the ear. So instead of drawing a face, you're just copying abstract shapes inside each square, which surprisingly improves accuracy as you keep moving forward in your drawing. So once the sketch was done, I covered the canvas with a thin layer of burnt umber of acrylic paint. Now the reason why artists choose to do this is that a white canvas makes judging colors much harder. And once there is another shade of something like an umber come on the canvas, it becomes much easier to start from the mid-tones perspective. And that's when you can see the lights and the shadows much clearly. And also psychologically, a canvas is much less scarier when it is covered in a specific color rather than it being plain white. So let's again understand the whole point of oil paint again. So before jumping into the face, I started painting the clothing area. Not because it's exciting, but because it's forgiving. Oil paint behaves very differently from acrylic. It stays wet longer, which is amazing for blending, but is also dangerous because you can accidentally destroy something you painted 5 minutes ago. So the first thing I focused on was paint consistency. If the paint is too thick, your brush drags and leaves streaks. And if it's too oily, then the paint slides around like butter on a hot pan. So the sweet spot is when the brush glides but also still holds the shape. And another important oil paint rule is fat over lean, and this simply means that each layer should contain slightly more oil than the previous one. This prevents cracking later and also makes blending easier in the upper layers. So the early layers were fairly thin, just enough paint to establish the main color zones and shadows, and at this stage perfection doesn't really matter. The goal is just to map the structure of the painting. Then comes about building depth. Now one mistake that beginners make with oil painting is trying to finish everything in one sitting. Oil painting really shines when you layer slowly, So after blocking the first layer, I left the painting for around 10 hours so that it can partially dry. And when you return to a slightly tacky surface, the next layer sits on top beautifully instead of simply blending or mixing into mud. And that's how you create depth, each layer refining the one below it. I slowly worked through the folds of the jacket, the zippers, the shadows in the fabric, letting each of these sections dry before adjusting the next. And yes, a lot of this process is basically paint, step back, question your life choices, fix it, and then repeat. So once the painting felt a little stable, I got back to the face. Now this is the live or die for a portrait. Baby portraits are typically more tricky because the transitions in the facial skin are much subtle. There are no specific wrinkles, no specific shapes, and if you just overdo or even exaggerate very slightly in any of these facial features, then congratulations, you have just made a 40-year-old baby. So instead of using strong contrasts, I simply worked around with subtle tones, and it was much easier when I just divide these subtle tones into three major parts, one being the mid-tone, which kind of is the majority of most of the painting that is covered with. Second is the highlight, and third became your shadow tone. So like I was saying, the mid-tone, since that covers most of the painting, I started with that and I slowly added shadows which are very slightly visible, at least under the eye sockets or around the nose or around the lips or anywhere just, going away from the cheeks area. So in oil painting, blending is more about just simply gently moving colors along rather than simply scrubbing the brush. And this is something contrast to how we work with probably something like an acrylic paint. And this becomes much easier. It's mostly like you're convincing the paint to mix, not forcing them. Then came the smile, probably the toughest area of this painting for me personally, because if you look at the reference here, the baby had a very subtle smile which kind of also looks like a smirk. Now this was very important to put this as it is on the canvas so that it captures the expression most accurately, because even when that smirk is slightly curved than it actually is, the painting will start looking more suspicious than catching the exact expression that's there in the reference. So this part involved mostly stepping back, squinting at the reference, and then just coming back to redo whatever has been done. Then came the last part, which was the hair. And I think this was mostly rewarding because at this point I had dealt with so many complications in the painting, say it about the clothing or giving a better look to the tiny hands and the feet, because it was important to show the separation in the fingers rather than clumping, which was again very important element to bring about in a realistic oil painting portrait. And of course, not to mention about the face, each of the features, and bringing the complexion together, and then just blending it and then bringing out that natural blush that the baby had. But here again, my client had interiors which were mostly beige to a mix of browns, so they wanted this painting to kind of even go with the interiors and to kind of even complement it. So once I had covered that whole area around the head with the mix of black and brown, all I had to do was just bring out strands individually from the head, mostly on the top, where I could show that a bunch of strands were again coming out of the head to make it look more natural. Again, this was a simple process where I had to just use a rather pointy rounded brush and just pull it off with the regular black and brown that I was using. Now to bring that up, all I had to do was just add some more hints of grey wherever there is light coming by. Now the light source in this specific painting was from the front, so if you can see, the highlights are mostly around the center of the hair that way. And with this, the painting was mostly done, and the final touches were where I had to bring the strands of hair on the face because the baby had long hair. Now this was slightly tricky, and these were the mistakes that I had made where I had underestimated my fat brush. I actually thought I could pull off a single strand using a brush of thickness something like an 8, which was, it is possible but probably not for me, and that's where a mistake happened where like a big blob of black came on the face. But again, thanks to the medium oil paints, they help you undo things much faster, which are almost always impossible in something like an acrylic paint. So now that everything was finished, I left it in a room which had direct sunlight and it kept it away from dust, and I had left it to dry for about 2 weeks, where I had kept coming in between to check if every little part of the painting had dried, and that is when I varnished it. So after varnish again, I had left it for about 1 day for it to dry. So that is how I had completed this huge painting, which I kind of honestly questioned myself if I would be able to do it, and especially for a client as a commission, that was sort of risky.
शाम सुबह मिलते नहीं, खालिद है पर दिलचस्प भी, सुबह पूछे रात शाम में क्या हंसी.
So finally, I would just want to say that if you are someone who is thinking about trying oil paint, or just trying to paint for that matter, I would say just go for it, because no other media is as forgiving as oil paints. I know there are things about linseed oil and turpentine that kind of makes it more smelly and is a lot of things to deal with at once. But trust me, once you get a hang of it, there is nothing more easier. And I think that's the reason why, because there's an involvement of oil. The oil paints are much more realistic, be it for a portrait or a landscape or any other abstract painting that you choose, are much more glossy, much more vibrant for the same reason. So thank you so much for watching this video, guys. But if you are someone who's looking for getting a painting ready for yourself, for your friends, family, for your own house, hall, bedroom, you can always reach out to us on Instagram, and I will leave my Instagram details below in the description, and you can just drop us a message and we'll get back to you. So until next time, I hope I'll return this time without taking it much longer than I did the last time. But thank you so much for watching this video. I am hoping that this was helpful. For any questions, doubts, suggestions, please feel free to comment below and I will get back. So I will see you next time. Until then, stay safe and stay happy.